Hello, sixth graders. Today we are going to be talking about plot. If you recall, plot was one of our vocabulary words from yesterday, one of those story vocabulary words, and we are going more in depth in what plot is today. So my heading today is plot, just like that. And the definition of plot is the events that make up a story. The events that make up a story. Now, the best way to do this is I am such a visual person. I like to draw things and actually see it take place. So we are going to do a little artistic drawing here. I'm going to tell you, it's really not that artistic, but it'll work. So bear with me as we draw this in our notebooks. It's going to be an odd looking shape. So I'm going to start by drawing here on the bottom like this. Then I'm going to slant upwards and then down about halfway and then draw another line like this. So this is what my little like diagram is going to look like. It's a shape that looks like this. So there's a line at the bottom here, and then it goes up about halfway down, and then a little line at the end. This is meant to represent a diagram or the plot of a story. This is like a visual to represent how a story goes from start during the story and to finish. There are a total of 5 components that make up a story, and those are going to be the 5 things that we talk about today. So the first one is the exposition. The exposition is at the bottom left-hand corner. It's this flat part. It's called exposition. And that's exposition. The exposition. It is that flat part there at the bottom. And we will define that in a moment. But that first part is the exposition here. Now, if I were doing this on like a full notebook page, I would have my heading, the definition of plot, my diagram, and right below that a visual of, oh my gosh, sixth graders, I literally just figured out how to scroll down on Explain Everything. This is amazing. Oh my gosh, this is going to make everything so much easier. I don't have to start a new page. Wow. Okay, this is great. So now I can actually pretend that I have a notebook like you. So I have my header, I have my definition, I have my diagram, and my first word, which is exposition. So below here, I'm going to define what exposition is. Man, I am so excited right now. So excited. Okay. Exposition. So below here on my notebook, I'm just going to start by writing exposition because I'm going to define it. Exposition. The definition of an exposition is basically the first event of a story. The exposition of a story are the first events. Basically, the only things that happen during the exposition or the very first part of the story is characters are introduced. Well, I should say characters and whatever situation those characters are in. So characters and situation are introduced. The exposition is typically the first and or second chapter of the book that you're reading. So basically, it's just like the first events, who is who, and what's going on. That's what the exposition is. Typically, the first couple chapters. Next part of our diagram up here, and I'm focusing back up here because we did our exposition, which represents the first couple chapters. Now we're going to talk about this really big piece here. It's a really big chunk. This, sixth graders, is our rising action. Our rising action. If you notice, sixth graders, the rising action, this part here is the largest piece in our diagram. That's because the rising action is the majority of the book that you're reading. So underneath here, I am going to define rising action. So rising action. And the rising action, like I said, is the main part of the story. It's the main part of the story, and it's where complications arise. This part, sixth graders, the rising action is typically the majority of the book. It's probably, I would say, 3/4 of a book, meaning it's right after the first couple chapters where you get the characters introduced, kind of what's going on, and then this big part is basically just watching everything unfold and all these conflicts start and complications and things happen. The rising action is the biggest part of your book. It is, like I said, the first 3/4 of a story. It's like almost over half of your story there. Then the next part of plot is this very top piece. It's right up there at the very top. This, sixth graders, is called the climax. The climax. CLIMAX. The climax. So after everything is introduced in the exposition and everything is building up in the book, then you come to the bam, the big part, the point that you've been basically waiting for this whole story, because everything's been building up to this. This is typically the most exciting part of the story, or the turning point. It's the wow moment, the climax. So, to define climax, the definition is the most exciting part of a story or the turning point. The most exciting part of a story or the turning point. The best way that I like to describe the climax is the wow part. It's the shocking part. It's when everything that you've been reading about finally happens. There's that big part of the book. So that, sixth graders, is what the climax is. The climax is typically close to the end of your book. It's mainly, like I said, this is 3/4 of the book, and then you have the most exciting part. And then, as you notice here, it starts going down. Things start to kind of calm back down. And this happens in stories. This part right here is known as the falling action. The falling action. The falling action. What this means, sixth graders, is that after the climax, the most important part, this is when things just kind of start to wrap up. It's when it's like what happens after the climax that leads to basically the conclusion. The reason that this black line is a lot shorter is because this is a much shorter part of the book compared to the rising action. This may only be a chapter or two after the climax because there may not be much of the book left. So, to define falling action, I'm going to go down. Oh, whoa, I just moved that. Whoa. Go down here to the bottom. I do not mean to be moving this right now. Stop it. Okay, falling action. And like I said, the falling action are the events that happen after the climax and it's where the conflict in the story moves toward a resolution. The falling action, events that happen after the climax, the conflict moves toward a resolution. So what this basically means, sixth graders, is that after the most exciting part, things are starting to calm down. Things are starting to, the conflict that was happening in the book, things start getting figured out. So that conflict is resolved, which leads us to our last and final part here. This is the last and final part of a story. And the last and final part of a story is known as the resolution. Resolution, RESOLUTION, the resolution. And it's just kind of a very flat and small piece of the book. It's the end of the story, basically. That's it. Everything is getting resolved, and the story is wrapping up here at the very end. Whoa. Let me zoom in here a little bit. Okay, so our last piece here, resolution. And what color? I used yellow. And the resolution is where the conflict is resolved. So sorry, I accidentally hit the plus button on the very bottom right there. My goodness, my apologies. The conflict is resolved and the story ends. The resolution is the end of the book, and it's where the conflict is resolved and the story ends. Now, some of you may be thinking, like, well, what about if there's a next book, Miss Friedenberg? And you're right. Maybe the actual, the big story that the author is trying to tell that may take multiple books, that story may not be over. But the story of this specific book that you're just finishing, there is a resolution to every book. Sometimes after the resolution, there is something like a cliffhanger to give you the idea that there may be another book, but there's always a resolution in every book that you read. There's some kind of closure. So to recap today, this is what you should have in your notes. We broke down plot. Every story has a plot, and the plot is broken up into 5 different parts, We have the exposition, which is the first part of the story. This is where everyone and things are introduced. Then you have the rising action. This is the majority of the book. This is when a lot of events start happening, which lead to the climax, the most exciting part of the book. The falling action is when things start calming down, and then the resolution is when the conflict and things are all wrapped up, and there is some closure. So, once you are done with these notes, please take a picture and upload them to Canvas, as always. Thank you very much, everyone. My gosh,